My name is Nader Hashemi. I'm the new director of the Center for Middle East Studies here at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies. And on behalf of the Center for Middle East Studies, on behalf of the Josef Korbel School, I'd like to welcome you all here to our international conference called Resolving the Syrian Crisis. I want to thank everyone for coming, particularly those who've traveled long distances. We have several guests here from the Middle East, and we appreciate the time that they've taken to be with us. Our new Center for Middle East Studies is devoted to developing a new scholarship on the Middle East, providing a forum for debating and raising both the quality and quantity of discussion and debate here in Denver on the Middle East. We hope to have numerous conferences over the coming years that deal critically, responsibly with the emerging sort of conflicts, issues that are at the top of the U.S. and international agenda with respect to the Middle East. And this is the first conference of what we hope will be a series of many conferences devoted to examining the contemporary politics of the Middle East. One issue that is obviously at the top of the international agenda and obviously the Middle East agenda is Syria. And we are going to be examining the case of Syria today. Three panels, three panels are set up today. Four panels, sorry, with the evening panel. So we're going to look at the regional and international dimensions of the Syrian conflict this morning. In the afternoon, we will look at the internal sort of dynamics of Syria, both the dynamics of the Syrian opposition, then the question of the post-Assad era. And then in the evening, we have our all-star panel of prominent sort of scholars and intellectuals. It's a public forum. We're hoping to get a sizable turnout, and then that will wrap up the evening. I do want to mention that there's been substantial interest in our conference. We did get an email about a week ago from a member of the UN Independent Commission of Inquiry on Syria, expressing interest in our conference, expressing access to the proceedings and the videotapes for possible use in a future UN report on Syria. So we're very happy about that. We do have plans to collect the papers and publish a book so that there'll be some record of this conference. That is something to watch out for. And my job here really today is to make sure that everything runs on time, to answer your questions, to host you. If you have any concerns, please feel free to approach me and I'll do my best to answer your questions. This conference could not have happened had it not been for the strong and generous support of John de Blasio and his foundation. I want to thank them publicly. I also want to thank the dean of the Josef Korbel School and his staff, who've been very supportive of this conference. Had it not been for them, we would not have been able to have organized this conference. Thank you very much. When we were putting this conference together, we were told that our dean, Ambassador Hill, was out of town, that he couldn't make it, but apparently his commitment to this conference, his commitment to this center required and resulted in him canceling his previous commitment and joining us today. So I'm very happy that he's sitting here in the front row. He has his own introductory and welcoming remarks, and I'll turn the floor over to Chris Hill.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nader. And it's true I canceled my other obligation, but that was in Washington, D.C. And so the opportunity to spend a weekend in Colorado versus Washington, D.C. was not such a hard choice. Let me join Nader in thanking everybody who has worked on this, in particular the people who have come such a long distance to come to this conference. I think certainly there are questions about whether the title "Resolving the Syria Crisis" is a bit of an overreach, perhaps an example of hope overcoming experience. But I tell you, if any place, if the Syria crisis can be resolved in any conference, it's going to be here in Denver in the Rocky Mountains. I'd also like to join Nader in thanking, in particular, John de Blasio, who kind of came into our lives, I think a little more than a year ago, and we have worked very closely with John and with his foundation, the Global Peace and Development and Charitable Trust. And so we're very pleased to, first of all, stand up this Middle East Center, because I don't think there is any area of the world more complex and more need of further analysis and more ideas than the Middle East. So this is really the first conference that the Middle East Center is hosting, but it's the first of many. And I think it's very appropriate that we start with a subject which is very tough, which has eluded the ability of some of the greatest minds in the country to deal with, and that is, of course, the Syria crisis. I have no doubt that when John Kerry gets into office, he will be consumed very much in his first weeks and months in office by the continuing Syria crisis. Nader, I think it's really well organized. I think the idea of looking at regional, looking at internal, and looking at post-Assad is very important, because I don't think President Assad is going to be with us much longer, and so I think it's very necessary to look at what the governance issues, what the challenges are. You know, I've always felt that before you talk about how to get rid of a dictator, you ought to figure out why the dictator got there in the first place, and sometimes the answers to that question can inform the former question. So I hope we can have a really good discussion, especially in this afternoon session, on some of the internal dynamics of this very complex country. And I think as we look to go beyond that, we can be asking the question whether putting aside Bashir al-Assad, we can be looking at the question of whether Syria will survive the Syria crisis. So I think there's a lot to do, a lot to discuss, and without further ado, I think we ought to get on with it. Thank you.
Well, usually conferences like this run behind schedule. We're actually 4 minutes ahead of schedule. So we have 4 minutes here to sort of get the first panel up and settled at the head table. If you want to take a washroom break or grab a coffee, we'll get started exactly at 9:30.
Nader always says the right thing. He said we'll begin at 9:30. But I have to correct him about one, because he said that the all-star panel is tonight. And he ought to have said one of the all-star panels is tonight. All of these are all-star panels, but this one, nobody can challenge it. This is an all-star panel. I'm honored to be here. My task is to see that they stick to time, and to say to His Excellency, time is up, is, I think, a good idea to do. And as Vice Provost, I could have done it to the deans, but not now. I'm a lowly professor at the University of Denver, Stern College of Law. And as I said, I'm honored, very pleased to welcome you to this first panel of the conference. After the opening session last evening, remarks that you heard this morning by Ambassador Hill and Professor Hashmi, this panel is going to focus on regional and geopolitical dimensions of the crisis. As you know, there seems to be no end in sight to the crisis. Heavy brunt of this crisis has been borne by civilians. This morning, you might have heard that the rebels have taken over another air place for the very strategic kind of air central, and the fighting goes on, bloody conflict goes on, and the number of dead, as you might have seen, estimated by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights at 600,000. What has really, 60,000, not 600,000, obviously. But you saw that Lakhdar Brahimi, who is the envoy, UN envoy and Arab envoy, he has said, the Arab League envoy, that next year it might exceed 100,000. Two things to keep in mind. The Security Council has been paralyzed, and as you know, it's because of the Russian veto. And the evolving international norm, the responsibility to protect, and two on this morning panel have been involved in that evolution. That hasn't been even on the table. You recall it was invoked and successfully in Libya, but it's not on the table. And then both sides have been responsible for violation of international human rights law, international humanitarian law. There have been many, many instances of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and every effort in order to have the issues referred to the International Criminal Court, created precisely in order to deter, to address crimes against humanity, war crimes, that has been a failure so far. And the primary reason has been the one that this conference is going to discuss, both the sectarian divide inside the country, regional, international ramifications, geopolitical considerations, and that is what this conference is going to do. So personally, I do want to commend the center for taking this kind of project. This is a new center. I applaud that Ambassador Hill and Professor Hashmi have started it. It's customary for the chair to say, I have distinguished speakers. Here indeed I do. And these are the three very, very distinguished speakers. But before I introduce them, let me share with you the format of the panel. Each speaker is going to speak approximately for 20 minutes. Could be a couple minutes over, but at 18, I'm simply going to mention to them, sending them a little note that they might kindly wrap it up in the next few minutes. The organizers have wisely considered that audience participation is vital, and therefore today, after their presentations, what I'm going to do as the moderator is simply to ask each speaker only one question. And they'll take probably a couple, 3 minutes to answer that question. That means that you'll have ample time to ask questions, but not simply to ask questions, but very, very briefly, if you have a statement to make, want to add to the conversation here, please feel free to do so, because that is the main purpose, that all of you who feel very strongly about this issue, that you have the opportunity to participate. Let me briefly mention to you, you have I hope that you picked it up, and in this brochure, the kind of thing, you do have each speaker's bio. But I do want to mention a couple things. Ambassador Christopher Hill came here, has given a great deal of visibility to the school. We're deeply honored that he is with us as ambassador to 4 countries, as having led the United States and all the Western countries on the 6 party talks on the North Korea, and then also having served as Assistant Secretary of State, as the person who was last in Iraq, and during that very volatile period, we are honored to have Ambassador Hill with us. Kindly join me in welcoming him. The second speaker is the gentleman who led this school for several years and gave it a great deal of visibility as well, was the president, former president of New Mexico University. He was the former president of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, widely published, and Tom Farrar. So kindly join me in welcoming him. And we have a very distinguished author, revered teacher, a person who has had a great deal of impact upon US policy, upon policy issues, and who had been instrumental when the responsibility to protect as a very new norm and as an innovative kind of initiative was being taken. I'm not going to introduce them later on because I don't want to interrupt the flow of conversation. So the speakers, as they are listed in your program, that is how they are going to speak. So first of all, it's going to be Professor, Dean, Ambassador Chris Hill. No, I'm so sorry. That's not how it is. It's going to be Professor Mohammed Ayoob. He'll start, Tom Farrar will go next, and then Christopher Hill. So I'm going to ask Professor Ayoob to begin, and I will be out of the way so that they can start the conversation, and I'll simply let them know after 18 minutes, time is up. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank Nader, my good friend Nader Hashemi, for inviting me to this distinguished panel, to join this distinguished panel at this very important conference. I'd also like to congratulate him for setting up the center and becoming its founder director. I've known Nader for a long time, and I think given his dynamic personality, this center is going to take off in no time. Now, I was hoping that Joshua Landis would precede me on this panel so that I could then say that everything that needs to be said about the internal situation has been said, and therefore all I have to do is to move on to the regional dynamics and how they influence the situation in Syria and how they impact upon this process that may or may not lead to the resolution of the current conflict. But unfortunately, Joshua has been moved to another panel. But nonetheless, I'd still say the same thing, that Joshua and many of the others who would be joining him for the rest of the day talking about the domestic situation will certainly do a much better job in addressing that issue than I would have had, because I don't have much experience dealing with the domestic situation in Syria. What I plan to do this morning is to make a couple of points and elaborate upon them. First of all, the very first point that I want to make is that unlike the Tunisian and Egyptian uprisings, there is a tendency to lump all of these together as the Arab Spring. But unlike the Tunisian and the Egyptian uprisings not merely in Syria but also in Bahrain have been held hostage by the requirements of regional and global rivalries, thus denuding the autonomous dynamics that determined the outcomes in Tunisia and Egypt. Of course, in Tunisia, but particularly in Egypt, there were external factors involved as well, not least the attempt to come in late in the day to try to take some of the credit for it by the Obama administration. But Tunisia and Egypt were resolved largely as a result of the interaction or the interrelation of forces within these countries. Bahrain was crushed with brutal force by the intervention of the Saudi regime, and not exactly with the blessings, but the fact that the Obama administration tended to look the other way when that was done, and for good reason, given the importance of Bahrain as the home of the Fifth Fleet. But it was really the international and the regional factors that determined the outcome in Bahrain. Syria is a mixed case, where the domestic as well as the regional and the global dynamics interact with each other, and the outcomes, therefore, are going to be much more difficult. It will be much more difficult to come to an outcome one way or the other. And I'm not making a moral judgment as to what the outcome should or should not be, but just to warn people that Syria has lost much of the autonomous dynamics within the country that could lead to a resolution. And therefore, neither can the Syrian crisis be understood, nor a resolution found, unless one looks at it in the context of what I call two interrelated balance of power struggles going on in the larger Middle East. The first one is between Iran and Saudi Arabia for preeminence in the Persian Gulf. And that's one of the reasons why both of them are so committed, I'll come to that in a moment, to one side or the other of the Syrian regime, because of the Syrian crisis, of the situation, because that, in a sense, is going to determine also, if not determine, at least have an influence on how the balance of power game is played out in the Persian Gulf. The other is a larger balance, the balance between the US-Israeli axis on the one hand, and Iran and its allies in the what's called the resistance front on the other, regarding the overall balance of power in the Middle East. And the Iranian nuclear issue, the right to enrich or not to enrich uranium up to and beyond a certain level, has become a part of that larger balance of power issue. But that's also being played out on the field in Syria. So unless we put the Syrian crisis in that larger context, one will not be able to understand what's really happening in Syria. And I just go over those or elaborate on that a little more. Syria, as those of us who have been studying the Middle East for a long time know, that for many decades it has been the bellwether of Arab politics, especially in times of intense ideological competition. And that's why the title of my talk, of the talk that I gave to the organizers, it's called The Struggle for Syria, the New Old Cold War in the Middle East. And it's really a play upon the titles of two classics that were published in the 60s and probably in the 60s, I think, both of them. The Struggle for Syria was the title of the book by Patrick Steele, the eminent British journalist, about what was going on in the Fertile Crescent in the 50s and 60s, particularly the struggle between the Hashemites on the one hand and the Arab nationalists led by President Nasser on the other, the Hashemites who ruled both Iraq and Jordan at that time. And the Cold War dimension comes from the book by Malcolm Kerr, his famous little book, but very, very influential, called The Arab Cold War, which again dealt with the rivalry between Arab nationalists and the conservative monarchies led by Saudi Arabia in those days. And in some ways, you see that what's happening now in the Middle East over Syria is a rerun, though not exactly a rerun of that drama. And for a number of reasons, it's not exactly a rerun, because this is a larger Cold War. It's not limited to the Middle East. It is a struggle for Syria, but I mean, not limited to the Arab world. It is a struggle for Syria, but one of the major protagonists in this Cold War is non-Arab Iran. Of course, Saudi Arabia is as I said, the other pole of power. So it goes beyond the Arab world only. Now, what is Syria's? I wanted to elaborate a little bit on Syria's importance to Iran. Syria has been the most dependable Arab ally as far as Iran is concerned. Even in the dark days of the Iran-Iraq war, during which time all the Arab regimes, with the exception of Syria, and particularly the Arabs, the regimes of the Gulf that had billions of petrodollars at their command, who financed to a large extent the Iraqi war effort, or the Iraqi invasion of Iran, in an attempt to nip the revolutionary bud, at the very beginning. At that time, Syria under Hafez Assad stood by Iran, not for sectarian reasons, because the Alawites are not really Shias, no matter what you think. Every Shia knows that the Alawites are not Shias. They're not. They're at best they are heretics. At worst, they are non-Muslims. So it was not a sectarian but a strategic link-up. In Syria, obviously, the Assad regime was in contention with the fellow Ba'athist regime in Iraq. And Iraq was at war with Iran, so Syria stood by Iran, and that history of that alliance has continued. It has also been since the 1980s the conduit for Iranian assistance, both financial and military, to the Hezbollah of Lebanon. There's also an economic dimension to this relationship, which I don't have the time to go into, but there has been very recently a gas pipeline agreement signed between Iran, Iraq, and Syria as well, with a $10 billion commitment, I think, on the part of Iran. Syria is also a part of what's been called the resistance front against Israel. And since Israel, in Iranian perceptions, is a major antagonist, not again for religious, primarily for religious or ideological, but balance of power reasons, in the Middle East, the alliance with Syria is important. So those are the major reasons why Tehran has invested so much in Syria. Now, as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, I think Saudi Arabia's primary motivation in terms of its support to the opposition, and again, I'm sure billions of dollars will eventually be invested in that support if they have not been already, is to force Iran in a way to divert its energies to the Fertile Crescent, to the Syrian front, so that its capabilities, diplomatic and political, are not fully exercised in the Persian Gulf, where the Saudis are in contention with or in a struggle for preeminence with Iran. The Bahrain was a part of that, so the strategy was, the reason why the Saudis did not want Bahrain to democratize was among others, was the apprehension on their part that a Shia majority, or even a majority-ruled Shia or Sunni in Bahrain would break out of the Saudi camp and may even ally itself with Iran. So the Saudi interest primarily is to get Iran bogged down in Syria so that it is not in a position to, as I said, to divert its energies towards the Persian Gulf. And this explains why, I think it's oxymoronic to expect the Saudis to support the democratization of Syria. After all, the Saudis, as we know, are, the very antithesis. The Saudi regime is the very antithesis of what we would call a democracy in the Middle East. So their commitment to the Syrian opposition is, again, primarily strategic in character. There are also global ramifications of this conflict, which extend beyond the region. The regional dynamics at work, in a way, link it to the global dynamics. The Russians and the Americans are involved in it as well. For the Russians, Syria is important because the Tartus base is the only base that the Russians have outside of the former Soviet territories. And therefore, symbolically, it's very important to Russia because it gives Russia the feeling that it is still a great power that could act globally and is not confined to the former Soviet space. The United States, I think, is involved, again, not so much in an attempt to democratize Syria, though there are certain constituencies in the United States that are firmly committed to the democratization process. But again, the way it's lined up, one, of course, it's lined up behind Saudi Arabia because it has an interest in the way the Saudi-Iranian competition for influence and power in the Persian Gulf plays out, because the Saudis are an ally of the United States and the Iranians are the primary antagonists. The primary power the country that is primarily responsible for challenging American political and military hegemony in the Persian Gulf. So there's that interest. And then there's the interest from it's a way also to punish Iran for the position it has taken on the nuclear issue. And of course, no policy, Ambassador Hill may correct me, but by and large, policies in the Middle East made in Washington are influenced by the impact of the Israeli lobby. So there is obviously that dimension to American policy towards Syria, that since Israel is again in contention with Iran, on the nuclear issue and wider balance of power issues, that Iran is seen as a primary antagonist of the United States. So there are all those calculations that go into American policy as far as Syria is concerned. And they don't have to do primarily with Syria, but to what's going on in the wider region and all these balance of power issues. Now, what happens if and when Assad is toppled is, of course, a major issue, and I don't want to go into that because I'm sure we will be discussing that in the other 2 or 3 sessions. I want to end on the note by end by saying that it's my firm belief that Syria has become so much a part of this region-wide tussle, and also in terms of the Russian-American rivalry in a way of the global balance of power, but primarily a part of this region-wide tussle for supremacy or preeminence, which is essentially, essentially about the recalibration of the 2 interrelated balances of power that I talked to you that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk. The one between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the other between the US-Israeli axis on the one hand and Iran and its allies of the resistance front on the other. That Syria, I'm afraid, has now become a sideshow of these wider and strategically much more important struggles going on in the region. The Iranian support to Assad and the US's Saudi support to his opponents can only be understood in the context of these larger struggles for power and influence in the Middle East. The resolution of the Syrian crisis, I believe, therefore, is linked to what happens in these other arenas and cannot be addressed in isolation from them. And we need to keep that in mind. I'll be willing to take questions on this. I think I've probably almost run out of time, Professor Nanda?
That's fine.
Yeah, so I'll be willing to take questions on these things. And I've also been working, I couldn't bring in the Turkish factor into this equation, which is something that I've been working on. But I'd be more than happy to respond to any questions about Turkey's position on Syria and why it has taken that position, because Turkey is a member of NATO and therefore a member of the Western alliance system, but it also, this government in particular over the last 10 years has been making making efforts, utmost efforts to keep its relationship with Iran on an even keel, and those have been damaged as a result of the Syrian crisis and the fact that the Turks and the Iranians are on different sides of that political divide. Because it is understood in Ankara, and probably, which I know better than I know Tehran, but it's understood in Ankara and probably in Tehran as well, that there cannot be a stable and legitimate security structure or security regime built in the Middle East without the consent and participation of the 2 pivotal powers in the greater Middle East, namely Turkey and Iran. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ayoob. Professor Farar's topic is what Syria has to teach neoconservatives and liberals about America's role in the world.
I want to join Mohammed in congratulating Nader and his deputy, Danny Postel, in organizing this very finely crafted conference. I'm not talking about all the speakers, at least about this one, but I think the shape of it is really remarkably fine. Congratulations, Nader and Danny. For most of recorded human history, mass atrocity like the slaughter of a besieged city's inhabitants was unremarkable. In our enlightened times, slaughter continues, something like 2 million in the past 2 years in the misnamed Democratic Republic of the Congo. But each slaughter is now mercifully reckoned as a teachable moment. Today, Syria is our teacher, and the lesson discoverable in its ruins about the limits of US power should be as discouraging to liberals as to neoconservatives. Let's turn first to the lesson for liberals. For liberals, Syria has been an efficacy test for the doctrine of the responsibility to protect against massive violations of the right to life, R2P as it's called idiomatically. And so far, it has taught that the doctrine still lacks an anchorage in the policy harbor of most consequential states. That's an insight that hardly counts as new knowledge. After all, both Russia and China, having acquiesced in the Security Council's endorsement of an essentially Western intervention to defend R2P in Libya, had retrospectively indicted the intervention for morphing from humanitarian relief to regime change, even though the removal of Gaddafi was a condition of the Libyan population's capacity to protect itself without a prolonged foreign intervention. So the Russian-Chinese post facto indictment amounted to a warning that for them, Libya was an anomaly, not a precedent. R2P is a normative product developed in the wake of NATO's contentious intervention in Kosovo, a product that seems to have been designed in part as a relatively subtle way of slipping humanitarian intervention into the corpus of widely accepted global norms. Syria begins its lesson for liberals by reminding us that with respect to R2P, Libya was a juicy precedent waiting to be picked. Atop it stood a cruel, half-mad dictator with no gift for co-option, self-distanced from and apparently despised by his neighbors, without a great power patron, who in his permanently paranoid condition had hollowed out the institutions, particularly the armed forces, regimes used for self-defense. A dictator who had conspicuously dissipated the nation's wealth, who ruled a country with a risible air defense system and only a few roads for moving troops from one danger point to another. Syria obviously lies near the other end of the spectrum of obstacles to exercising the responsibility to protect. Deliciously enticing as Libya should have been to the states that wish to put some flesh on the bones of R2P, without US leadership, Gaddafi would still be dining off the Libyan population. Washington provided the air power that halted Gaddafi's troops on the threshold of Benghazi. It provided much of the real-time intelligence and logistical support for the follow-on airstrikes by European allies. Its political power, Washington's political power, marshaled Arab and European support for the intervention, and presumably was exercised to forestall the otherwise predictable Chinese and Russian vetoes of the legitimating Security Council resolution. In short, even for this extraordinarily easy case for R2P, the US had to play the role of Madeleine Albright's indispensable nation. But the manner of its performance, leading from behind, as one self-congratulatory White House spokesman put it, augured the self-restraint Washington has exhibited since slaughter began in Syria. Given the rolling effect of the Arab Spring, and given the Assad family regime's history of violence, and given its roots in a sectarian minority, ready to identify any opposition as an existential threat, from the very moment that public protest began, President Obama could foresee the imminence of slaughter. So as soon as the Syrian government began murdering peaceful protesters, mirroring Gaddafi's reaction to the first open signs of opposition, we had, in effect, a Benghazi moment. Killing had begun, and a much greater atrocity appeared imminent. Contemporary diplomacy has psychologically institutionalized a standard sequence of responses by external actors to massive atrocities. First diplomacy, then economic sanctions, and finally, if both fail to stem the multiplication of atrocity, contemplation of the use of force. Within the traditions of the Security Council, this sequence has almost sacred status. If, however, we accord high value not merely to halting, but to preventing crimes against humanity, then this sequence needs to be telescoped, even in some cases stood on its head. Last month, when reports of possibly impending use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime began to circulate, President Obama declared publicly, you may recall, that their use would cross a red line, thus seeming to imply a readiness to assault the regime if the line were crossed. This move by our cautious president was prudent, even praiseworthy. But it raised the question of why the line was drawn at chemical weapons. They are not necessarily more lethal or intrinsically indiscriminate than the bombardment of entire neighborhoods, which has killed thousands of civilians and undoubtedly mutilated many more. If in drawing a red line, the president was responding to a felt humanitarian imperative, shouldn't the red line have been drawn much sooner, together with an unambiguous statement of the consequences of its being crossed? The president could have sent an emissary to Damascus to meet with Bashar al-Assad and senior officials of the armed forces and the security services to tell them bluntly that the U.S. would use force if the torture and murder of peaceful protesters continued. Conversely, the emissary could have added, the president would publicly applaud the enforcement of civil liberties, including the right of association and the opening of dialogue with representatives of all sectors of the population. Did the U.S. have the military capacity to decapitate the regime through an intense land and sea-based aerial assault, the shock and awe experience to which Saddam Hussein had been introduced in 2003? At a minimum, it could, I believe, have decimated senior officials in a first strike, which could have been followed by a warning to the survivors that further attacks would follow at times of our choosing if repression continued. And again, we could leaven the warning with an assurance that we sought not regime destruction, but regime opening to embrace all the elements of Syrian society. It's not unreasonable to believe that so decisive and violent an initiative would have saved thousands of lives and avoided the displacement of more than 2 million people. It would, moreover, have signaled a serious U.S. commitment to political reform in the Middle East, a commitment probably not effectively communicated over the past 2 years by President Obama's cautious movements, particularly in the case of Egypt, movements which have seemed always to follow hesitantly in the wake of events. It would also have constituted a useful warning to Iran and Hezbollah about the readiness of the U.S. to deploy kinetic force even after exhausting and demoralizing experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq. Despite its arguable virtues, this scenario does not appear to have achieved the status, even of a quickly expelled intruder, in the anteroom of Obama administration ruminations about policy towards Syria. Nor does any other scenario involving the decisive application of military force seem to have acquired any traction. It's fair to say, then, that insofar as R2P is concerned, U.S. policy, since atrocities began to accumulate, has merely confirmed the obvious. First, that when the U.S. is not itself prepared to use force to end crimes against humanity, there is no effective alternative. Secondly, that before contemplating the use of force to end slaughter, the U.S. will exhaust political and economic options, however much they are calculated to fail. And thirdly, that even after it is clear that non-kinetic means are failing, the U.S. will very rarely overcome its reluctance to risk casualties or even much treasure where only humanitarian interests are seen to be at stake. That's the lesson for liberals. What's the lesson for neoconservatives? The U.S. response to Syria, particularly the options that haven't been seriously considered, was foreshadowed by the U.S. response to the Arab oil boycott of 1973. At that time, one of the most original foreign policy thinkers in the United States, Robert Tucker, wrote a series of articles for a neoconservative journal that asked a question analogous to the query of Sherlock Holmes in one of his most famous adventures. The question Holmes said to Dr. Watson is, why didn't the dog bark? The analogy would be closer if Holmes had asked, why didn't the dog bite? Tucker's dog was the United States. When in the last millennium, Tucker asked rhetorically, has a great power allowed so weak a political entity as Saudi Arabia, the linchpin of the oil boycott, to threaten its vital interests? Indeed, to threaten it at all. Previously, Tucker observed, at the first sign of insolence, a strong state would have dispatched its gunboats to administer a violent lesson in the realities of power. What's remarkable in light of history, Tucker wrote, is that the Nixon administration does not appear even to consider seizure of the Saudi oil fields, but rather contents itself with the thin resources of diplomacy as if it were dealing with an equal. This historically anomalous behavior, Tucker concluded, did not reflect a measured assessment of costs and benefits. The real explanation for U.S. behavior, Tucker argued, is subjective. In the wake of the apocalyptic destruction inflicted by the two world wars, there had evolved a consensus encouraged by the United States to strip legitimacy from the open, blunt use of superior military strength to appropriate the resources of a recognized sovereign state, however weak or misgoverned or peculiar in its customs, or to remove a regime for behavior within its territory that offended the values or material interests of more powerful states. And the U.S. had itself signaled the doctrine's operative force when it used its financial power in 1956 to abort the Anglo-French assault on Egypt. Tucker's explanation of the U.S. response to the boycott was insightful, but it was partial. What it omitted was the deep ambivalence embedded in the American national identity, an ambivalence that survives to this day. Some 2 decades after the Tucker article, and in the wake of the Soviet Union's dissolution, American neoconservative publicists inveighed against the psychologically and institutionally embedded normative restraint on the exercise of American muscle to which Tucker had referred. The president, they argued vehemently, as the elected leader of the country, should feel free to employ whatever means he deems optimal to pursue ends which, in his judgment, best advance the national interest, which by divine dispensation happens to coincide with the general human interest. Following the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, neoconservative publicists and their allies inside the administration told the president and the nation just what those ends should be. In sum, they could be reduced to one end, namely the establishment of a democratic capitalist Pax Americana, at least in the Middle East and West Asia. Establishing it would probably require, in some instances, the replacement of intractable regimes by brute force. So be it. They understood perfectly well that this was an imperial project in the classical sense, and they were not uncomfortable with that description. They wrote as if their views, unlike those of cosmopolitan liberals with their sheepish cant about the virtues of international law and institutions and the necessity of taking account of world opinion, as if their views were in harmony with the sentiments of the generality of Americans. Now, the extent to which they actually believed that in that harmony is subject to doubt. Because if a people's conception of collective identity is best evidenced by the long historical arc of its country's foreign policy, there should have been doubt. In fact, if history is our guide, and what else do we have? After a moment of deliberation following the Spanish-American War, when the U.S. acquired Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, the generality of Americans have refused to identify the national interest with the classical sort of imperialism in which one people openly denied to another control of its political life, its land, and its resources. At the same time, however, Americans have, in the course of the past century, tolerated, if not always embraced, a foreign policy marked by degrees of involvement in the affairs of other countries that have been intended to, and have not infrequently succeeded, in deeply influencing the development of their political institutions and the shape of their domestic, as well as their foreign policies. Involvement's been open in many cases, clandestine in others. It has invariably involved local actors willing, often presumably eager, to advance their own interests in ways that, at least for a time, seemed to coincidentally advance American ones. Many, but hardly all, forms of our involvement have been consistent with international law. Training the counterinsurgency forces of a vicious government, as opposed to helping an ambitious soldier topple an existing government, may be morally repulsive, and yet be indisputably compatible with international law. To the extent that the U.S. has promoted its interests in association with recognized governments like Saudi Arabia, its behavior could reasonably be described as nothing more than the diplomacy of a great power. However, particularly when the U.S. has also employed methods that do not comply with international law, as when it has subverted regimes or collaborated with them in crimes against their own peoples, it is equally reasonable to describe U.S. behavior as indirect imperialism if its overall and intended effect has been to alter the probable trajectory of a country's political development. I use the phrase indirect imperialism not to indict, but simply to describe a particular foreign policy subgenre, one in which a great commercial power with a democratic tradition is likely to fall. Indirect imperialism is not necessarily more compatible than the direct sort with the human rights or human welfare of affected peoples. In Iran, it aborted the country's one promising democratic opening, with consequences that resound to this day. In Guatemala, it produced and sustained a regime of military oligarchical collaboration. During the 4 decades following its creation in 1954, killed a percentage of the population equivalent to the massacre of something in the range of 5 million Americans. Whether the indirect imperialism practiced by the U.S. in the Middle East for the past 60 years has optimally served the American national interest is debatable. From the perspective of a great power, the trouble with the indirect form is the absence of a clear hierarchy of authority in its relations with clients. And at least as institutionalized in the practice of American diplomacy, particularly towards Saudi Arabia, the state that's become the centerpiece of our Middle Eastern policies, the U.S. has appeared more like a supplicant than a hegemon. For surely a rational hegemon would have long ago ordered the Saudis to block the tidal flow of funds from state and private sources in the Saudi kingdom to support the evangelical spread of a harshly intolerant version of Islam profoundly hostile to Western interests and values. The practice of indirect imperialism not only inhibits the firm integration of the policies of clients into the hegemon's grand strategy, it also seems to discourage the hegemon from organizing itself optimally to execute a rational grand strategy. For instance, a self-consciously imperial state, above all one intending to exercise a dominating influence through local actors, would have recruited from the region and methodically trained and loyalty tested a large cadre of agents, thousands, drawn from every tribe and sect, and these agents of influence would have infiltrated official institutions in these countries and social movements, and been able, in cases like Syria, to identify quickly and confidently the appropriate recipients of the hegemon's material support and facilitate its delivery to the right people. A powerful, coherent, and self-consciously imperial state would also avoid investing so largely in conventional military forces so as to severely constrain its ability to empower favored local actors and in other ways to insinuate its influence. So clearly, the U.S. has not been ideologically well equipped to be such a state. The problem is not merely the psychological difficulty of rationalizing democratic principles with the denial of self-determination to other peoples, it's also political and structural. Powerful cultural forces within our electorate are hostile to large-scale expenditures for the incremental accumulation of influence over other countries. A religiously infused nationalism encourages a Manichaean populism, conducive to occasional explosions of conventional military force rather than the slow, patient accumulation and exercise of influence. In addition, the maintenance now over many decades of extensive conventional forces and reserves, largely armed by national corporations, and the coincident idealization of the military profession have helped block much larger scale investment in subtler instruments of influence. For instance, a third even of the trillion incremental dollars spent on the Iraq war thus far could have financed the construction and operation of a vast number of schools for poor children throughout the Middle East and West Asia, administered by Islamic educators of theologically moderate views. So where does that leave us? I would say that the creaking plod of U.S. policy since Syria began butchering peaceful protesters simply confirms that the U.S. is neither willing nor now able to play an imperial role, direct or indirect, in the Middle East and West Asia. Of course, we still can defeat any conventional military force, and thus, if we choose, open the way for foreign occupation of a country, a task that the U.S. itself is unlikely to take up again in the near future. And Washington can rain death from the skies, as the Obama administration has been doing in Yemen and Pakistan, but seems unwilling to do without Security Council authorization, where potential targets are officials of recognized states. It limits itself for not unpersuasive reasons. One is that unauthorized violence blurs the distinction between legitimate force and terrorism. And the other is the difficulty of finding or if found assuring the triumph of a regime superior to the one decapitated. So Syria is a warning to desperate peoples in far-off countries in need of protection that they should keep their expectations low. While the U.S. remains indispensable in the success of protection projects for the reasons I've suggested, as well as the country's fiscal difficulties, it will rarely invest largely in such projects unless most of the burden can be outsourced. Unfortunately for those in need, the states best equipped to share the burden militarily, Russia and China, do not yet share the sense of responsibility, such as it is, in the current or any prospective American presidential administration. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Ambassador Hill's topic is political outcomes for a Syrian settlement.
What's the name of that topic?
That's what I was told.
Man, I don't know where that came from. No, I'm kidding. It's all right. Anyway, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this issue. But I must say, this is probably about the toughest issue that has emerged in the Middle East in some time. And I think it is one, as I mentioned earlier, that I think has bedeviled the United States government and will continue to do so, because there are no easy answers to the Syrian issue. And I think one of the reasons there are no easy answers to the Syrian issue is there is no easy analysis of what the Syrian issue is. Is it a struggle between an authoritarian leader and a democratic opposition? To some extent it is, but to some extent it certainly is not. Or is it sectarian? And again, I think to some extent it is, but to other extent it's not. And so how you define the Syrian issue, I think, will very much inform what you might want to do about it. One of the many unintended consequences of the American adventure, if you will, in Iraq was the fact that we knew about the fault line between an authoritarian regime, almost a totalitarian regime in the form of Saddam Hussein. We knew about that fault line. I don't think we quite appreciated the fault line that existed between Shia community and Sunni community in the Arab part of Iraq, although we knew about the Kurdish issue with the Arabs. And so in going in, we essentially created a concept by introducing democracy of having majority rule. But what is a majority? I mean, what are people's self-definition of how do they define themselves politically such that they would be in a majority or a minority? And in the case of Iraq, people came to see themselves, unfortunately, in a sectarian setting. That is, you looked at the political structures being created in Iraq, and you saw that they became either Kurdish-based parties, Shia-based parties, or Sunni-based parties. Now, many countries have faced these problems, that is, people's political identity being derived from a sectarian identity. In the old Yugoslavia, you were not allowed to use a sectarian or an ethnic identity to describe your party. But everyone kind of knew the code words, knew what parties really were. In the Iraq context, the Sunni minority, wanting to describe itself by something apart from the Sunni minority, called itself the Iraqi National Party. There's no mention of Sunni in that. And in fact, when you talk to the organizers of the Iraq National Party, they would say, well, we're not Sunnis. I mean, yes, we have Sunnis, but we also have Shia. We also have Kurds. We have all kinds of people in our party, so you can't really call us a Sunni party. But when you ask most Iraqis, who's in the Iraq National Party, they would say that's the Sunni party. And I remember seeing this issue come up in Kosovo. For example, Slobodan Milosevic, when he would have meetings with with various international groups, including the U.S. government, he'd have a large delegation, and he'd say, you Americans, you think the League of Democrats of Kosovo, that they're the only people who represent the Albanians. But right down here, right here in my delegation, I have an Albanian. He's not part of the League of Democrats of Kosovo. And of course, what he had done was found some hapless Albanian somewhere and made him part of his delegation to suggest that, you Americans, what are you talking about? This has nothing to do with ethnic identity. This has to do with how people think about various issues. And he would turn to Mehmet here and say, Mehmet, do you really support autonomy or independence for Kosovo? Oh, no, Mr. President, we don't do that at all. We support you for president of Serbia and therefore for Kosovo. So just figuring out how people identify themselves, what their political identity is, I think is a very key question. And with respect to Syria, the longer this has gone on, the longer the staying power of this very amorphous group of people who are opposed to Assad, opposed to the Assad regime, the clearer it is becoming and the more distilled it is becoming as being a Sunni sectarian group bent upon the creation of majority rule, with majority being defined as Sunni sectarian. Now, you can debate that proposition, but if you ask Alawites, if you ask Christians, if you ask Kurds in Syria, who is that opposition, they'll largely tell you these are Sunni sectarian. Now, are they all Sunni sectarian? Of course not. But you have many people who are very urban, very modern, and wanting to see a concept of civil society in Syria. And can they eventually succeed with that vision? Can they eventually succeed in sidelining some of the sectarian forces that are part of this opposition? That is the question. That is the very essential question. Because there are many people who believe quite the opposite, that the Sunni sectarians will ultimately be successful in sidelining the people who believe in civil society. So that comes to the question, how are you going to assist this very amorphous group of opposition? I think the U.S. position has been that we cannot work with Assad. He is simply beyond the pale. We need to work with the opposition. It is out of the opposition that the future of Syria will emerge. And therefore, in dealing with this opposition, we need to support some groups and assure that some other groups are sidelined. I would say the U.S. position is to support a more secular rather than sectarian concept of opposition. It would be the U.S. Position that we would try to attract secular, more democratically minded, more modern minded Alawites to this opposition. After all, if you're an Alawite, it doesn't mean that you have to support Bashar al-Assad's concept of governance. It would be the U.S. position that that within this opposition, we'd like to see some Kurd representation, that there are Kurdish elements who'd like to see a more democratic Syria. So we've basically chosen a vision of trying to work with the opposition in the hopes that the good guys within the opposition, good guys in our case being defined as people with a kind of secular, tolerant view of other, self and other, would prevail. Now, is that the view of other countries? I think with respect to the Saudis, with respect to the Gulf states, you'll see a much more willingness to support Sunni sectarians. And why are they doing that? You know, how is this? Why is this process emerging? I think one of the reasons is that the Saudis tend to regard not only the Alawites as some kind of Iranian surrogates, but the Saudis also have been very concerned about the fact that there is a rise of Shia political identity in the Middle East. Again, the Shia political identity, which was pretty recessive. You know, if you look at Kuwait, for example, where there are many Shia there, but they have not had a political identity. But as a consequence of the U.S. Invasion in Iraq, Shia political identity became more open and became really, I think, a sectarian identity for modern political parties. And I think from the Saudi point of view, this has been worrisome. And they see it not only as worrisome when they look at the consolidation of Shia political power in Iraq, they look at their own East Province, where they see a great majority of Shia in the East Province, and they worry whether that majority of Shia could be consolidated in some kind of political expression, which would give rise to some kind of separatist trends. And by the way, you don't need to be a hydrocarbon engineer to understand where Saudi oil is. It's basically in the Shia areas of East Province. So from the Saudi point of view, to look at what has already happened in Iraq is to also look at concern that if something's going to emerge in Syria, they would like it very much within the Sunni, back in the Sunni fold. Indeed, as the U.S. has pulled out of Iraq, as our influence has waned in Iraq, I think more and more what you see is an effort by the Sunni Arab states to somehow seek and achieve a Sunni restoration in Iraq. Iraq was under Sunnis not only for decades but for centuries, especially if you count the Ottoman occupation. So there's an effort from the Sunni Arab states to see that Iraq somehow is able to have order restored. At the same time, the Iranians, not wanting to see the return of Sunni political authority in Iraq, they are also supporting extremist Shia groups in Iraq to see that Iraq remains Shia, remains somewhat more benign to Iran interests, and remain perhaps a kind of bridge to other Iranian interests in Hezbollah, with the Hezbollah and with others. So the stakes in Iraq remain very high, and with a very uncertain outcome. And if you see the developments in Syria, you can see why people like Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki are very concerned with the outcome. Back in 2009, I was asked to go in and talk to Nouri al-Maliki and assure him that in going to Damascus and having George Mitchell's team send people to Damascus and talk to Bashar al-Assad, we were doing so in the context of the Golan Heights, in the context of trying to recruit Assad to a more a position where we could work with him on an eventual Arab-Israel settlement. And so I went in to talk to Maliki about this and to reassure him that this was something in the context of our Arab-Israel policies. And Maliki looked at me and he said, "You have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with in Damascus. Do not tell me that you're going to be going in there and you're going to be a friend of Bashar al-Assad. You have no idea what he is like. You have no idea what conditions he will eventually exact from you. And you have no idea the degree to which he will lie to you, and he will not be a part of any effort that you think you can organize for progress on the Golan Heights." So for me, there was a certain bitter irony as we fast forward several years later that Maliki's concerns now are certainly about his old nemesis, al-Assad, but also about what is to follow the Assad regime. What kind of regime could come afterwards? And while I haven't had that discussion with Maliki, I think it would go something like this: you Americans, you have absolutely no idea what you are dealing with after Assad. You could well find a very Sunni sectarian entity coming there, and all that you have worked for in this country, in Iraq, would be up for grabs. So, in short, there are no easy outcomes, and there's no easy sort of process to get there. But what I would encourage from a policy point of view is that we not only focus on the issue of uniting the opposition, but we focus on what would be the political arrangements afterwards. People often draw analogies between Bosnia and Syria, saying, look at the carnage in Bosnia, we sat around and did nothing. Look at the carnage in Syria, we're sitting around and doing nothing. Why can't we do something? And what people remember about doing something is the fact that we dropped bombs in Bosnia. What people are forgetting that we did in Bosnia was to create political arrangements that were workable for the future. That is, by 1994, well before Americans were dropping bombs in Bosnia, we had some political arrangements for Bosnia. It was called the Contact Group Plan. It was worked out among European Union countries, the United States, and Russia. It was an effort to create a kind of federalism in Bosnia where the Serbs would have something, the Croats, the Bosnian Muslims, now known as the Bosniaks, would have something, and we worked out some political arrangements, and everything following the summer of 1994 became an effort in trying to get those political arrangements accepted by all the political players there, and they finally were after the Dayton Peace Accords in November 1995. I submit that what is really the missing link in the international community's efforts in Syria is not the consensus that somehow Assad needs to go. He does need to go. He really, you can put a fork in him because he is truly, truly done. But what we need is some kind of political arrangements where the Alawites, who are today fighting and fighting in very tough terms, but not necessarily fighting for Bashar al-Assad, they are fighting to prevent a future that they worry about even more than they worry about their future under Assad. We need to make clear to them what their future will look like. We need to make clear to the Kurds what their future will look like, to the Druze, to the Christian. We really need to work on what these future political arrangements are going to be. It is not so much a question of getting rid of Assad. We know he has to go. It is not so much a question of having elections. And by the way, in that part of the country, in that part of the world rather, elections are simply referenda, and when you have referenda, or they are actually not so much elections, not so much referenda, they're more of a census. You can predict with almost 100% certainty how people will vote. They will vote as Druze, they will vote as Kurds, they will vote as Christians, they will vote as Sunnis or as Alawites. So the issue is not so much elections. The issue is to get beyond that and to figure out what kind of constitutional arrangements can be achieved. One of the questions that the Russians constantly ask of us is, what are you going to do the day after Assad leaves? What's the political arrangements there? You know, the Russians have a cynical side to them and their policies under Vladimir Putin, no question. But just because people are cynical doesn't mean that they don't ask some of the right questions. And that is an important question. What are the political arrangements? What are political arrangements that will be workable, that will convince people that they don't want to be the last person to die in a conflict? And I think there really ought to be a greater effort for all of us, including the Russians, to sit down together and work on political arrangements rather than work on the question of whether Assad should stay or go. I think everyone, and I think even the Russians in their unguarded moments, admit that Assad needs to go. I will mention one other country because I've dealt with them over the years, and that is the question of whether China has some big investment in al-Assad. I can assure you China does not have any investment in him. China simply looks for a situation that has calmed down, and a situation that ideally from their point of view does not include the commitment of Western troops, especially the commitments of troops under a UN Security Council resolution. The Chinese feel very burned by the Security Council resolution, by the interpretation of the Security Council resolution on Libya, and have simply said they won't accept that again. I think that is also part of the thinking that animates the Russian position. So I think as difficult and problematic and perhaps at times impossible as the Syrian situation looks, it behooves us, I think, to work on what the political arrangements can be. Is it going to be some kind of sectarian federalism? Is it going to be some kind of territorial federalism? What type of political arrangements can be found? And I think when those are found, I think the Iraqis, the Iranians, everybody can be convinced that they will be a piece of the, they can support something that keeps some modicum of their own interests preserved. So with that, we can go to a more interactive portion of this conference.
Thank you, Ambassador Hill. I think you all have to agree with me that we are indeed enriched by these comments. They have been not simply thoughtful, but pretty far-sighted. And I know that you have plenty of questions and comments. I'm simply going to ask you to be brief. But before I do that, I have a question for each one of them. And as the chair, I'm going to use that prerogative. So the first question is going to be to Professor Ayoob. And I do want to thank you very much for putting the Syrian crisis in a broader regional and international context. And I thank you for your comments. My question is going to be based upon what you said. And let me mention that to you. You said it's clear that no such negotiated settlement will be possible unless the various regional global protagonists involved in the Syrian crisis, and you mentioned Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Iran, US, Russia, that they endorse such a move. They allow intra-Syrian negotiations to succeed and without any negative impact. I think you're absolutely right. How is it going to come about? Because every effort to find some kind of transitional arrangement has failed. Kofi Annan, who was seen as a wonderful negotiator and a mediator, had to surrender. So is Brahimi at the present time simply saying that unless we can find a settlement, it's going to be chaos. So that was going to be my question, but I want to add, at the end of your comments, you talked about Turkey. And Turkey is a major player. At the present time, the Netherlands, the United States, we're sending those Patriot missiles. Turkey has been involved in it very, very closely in the last few months. And so if you could kindly combine those two things, I would deeply appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Professor Nanda. I think, like everyone else, I'm also at a loss to figure out how there could be a consensus that could be evolved amongst all the major players, the major external players. And that's why I think the outcome is so much up in the air. The immediate players in the vicinity of Syria are Iran, Russia, and Turkey. The Saudis and the Americans, if, in the final analysis, I believe, will go home when Bashar falls, like they did in Afghanistan, when the Russians withdrew, and leave it to the regional powers to come to a conclusion, or bring this to a conclusion. I think that is why one should distinguish amongst the five that I've mentioned. There's an inner core which consists of Turkey, Iran, and Russia, and a consensus among these three is far more important than a five-power consensus. The Saudis can play spoilers, the Americans can play spoilers, but I think these three immediate neighbors are much more invested in finding, or should be invested in finding, a solution, because if there isn't a solution, if Syria descends into chaos, it may already have done so, it will become like in Afghanistan. And then the ripples will have an impact on the wider region. And that brings me to Turkey. I'm actually very concerned. I've written about this to the consternation of some of my friends in the Turkish government, because in the last 2 or 3 things, and Professor Falk might have seen some of those, my interview in Zaman, my article in Yale Global, and before that in other places, in which I've actually been quite a harsh critic of the Turkish over-involvement. I wrote a piece in The Guardian of the Turkish over-involvement in Syria, because I see the analogy between Syria, it's not a Syria-Bosnia, I think that's the analogy that you talked about. I see the analogy between Syria and Afghanistan. I see the analogy in this form that, that what's happening today, God forbid, would turn Syria into another Afghanistan. It would descend into chaos, anarchy, statelets based upon warlords taking power based on sectarian or ethnic identities. And the impact on Turkey, I think, would be tremendous, even more than it would be on Iran or on Russia. In some ways, the Turkey went into Syria, or got involved in Syria for some of the right reasons. It was a democratic country, its democratic legitimacy was at stake if it didn't take the right stance on Syria, particularly when its democratic image had become tarnished because it did not take the right stand on Bahrain. And there was a lot of criticism of that from within Turkey itself. Secondly, Erdogan, the Prime Minister Erdogan, who is a very huge ego, and his Foreign Minister Davutoglu,
Who's a bigger ego?
well, were very miffed at the fact that Assad gave them assurances of a compromise and a negotiated settlement of the opposition that he then did not implement. Turkey also got into Syria. I think it overdid it in a way because it wanted to signal to the West that it was on the side of the good guys, namely the Western powers. That it was on the side of the Western powers because on Syria, that its position on Syria coincided with those of the Americans and the Western powers, because there had been a lot of criticism of Turkey for turning east, for what it was criticized for becoming a Muslim or seeing itself as a Muslim power. Which I think is or an Islamic power, which is very stupid because it is a Muslim power. I mean, nobody can deny that. But it wanted to also send that signal. But unfortunately, the Turkish leaders did not calculate, and I've been quite sympathetic to the Turkish foreign policy and its opening towards the Middle East. And so on, did not fully realize what Syria could turn into, that it could become their Afghanistan, and they would become Syria's Pakistan. Because again, for 2 reasons. What happens if Syria really goes down the sectarian path? The impact on the Kurdish issue in Turkey, the relationship between the Turkish Alevis, who are not the same as the Turkish Alawites, but they sympathize with the Turkish Alawites, among other reasons, because they also fear Sunni domination. That would deteriorate, and since they are concentrated in southeastern and eastern Turkey, like the Kurds are, what that would do. And there is one thing which has not been commented upon I think substantially, which is Turkey's relations with Iran. I said this in passing at the end, that it would be impossible to construct a legitimate and stable structure of security in the greater Middle East without both Iran and Turkey being a part of it. And there is a lot of convergence of interests, and I don't want to go into that in greater detail, between Ankara and Tehran on these issues. But Syria, and to a certain extent Iraq, have messed up Turkish-Iranian relations. So I personally think that it wasn't worth for Ankara to sacrifice or put its relations with Tehran at risk by being over-involved in Syria.
But thank you very much.
I just want to comment really briefly, because I really agree with just about everything Professor Ayoob has said. The only thing about Turkey, though, is I would like to point out that I think the Turks were very concerned about this kind of good neighbor policy that they have had, and this certainly extended to Iran, and they certainly got themselves into some trouble with us, especially when they tried to, along with Brazil, try to work out this enrichment agreement with the Iranians, really without working at all with us on that. But I think that kind of good neighbor policy has given way to another policy, which is a kind of historic rapprochement in the Arab world. And you know, the Turks can easily, and they have done so, I think, have overplayed their hand in the Arab world. I think they took the view that when it became clear that Assad was simply not going to make it, I think most people would agree with me, it's surprising that he's stayed this long. I think the Turks very much switched over to this kind of support of Sunni insurgents, and perhaps even including military supplying of those insurgents. And I think the Turks did that to kind of culcate or to gain some favor among Gulf states, but also in Egypt as well, since a lot of this Sunni insurgency is Muslim Brotherhood inspired, not to completely, not to suggest the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria is the same as Egypt. But I've got to say, when the Turks have kind of sat down with the Egyptians, their role has not really been appreciated, and I think the Turks need to do a little better job of respecting the several hundred-year history that these Arab states have had with the Ottoman Empire, which was not all peaches and cream.
Well, thank you. And as you began, why don't I turn to you and very briefly ask a question about, you talked about political identity and focused on it appropriately. There is at least a feeling that jihadists have been infiltrating into the opposition, and that as time goes on, they are getting stronger. And I think as you look into the future and look at the crystal ball, you said that we didn't think that he would survive so long. And I think at the present time, you find that he is pretty defiant, and he has been thinking about 2014 and 2014 elections, and he keeps talking about them. As you look into the crystal ball, how do you see all that emerging in the future?
Well, I don't see really in any political arrangements, I really don't see a future for Bashar al-Assad. Maybe some of his supporters can gain or can be in those political arrangements, but I think for him and his immediate family, I think the game is over. So I think the real issue is to assume he's gone and then come up with some kind of constitutional arrangements. Now, as you know, in Lebanon, they have specific constitutional arrangements of who gets which position. As an American, you don't like this. I mean, because the idea that the Shia get this job and the Sunni get that job is simply not what we like to see, and for good reason. I think in working with the Iraqis on their constitution, we worked very much against the proposition that the Sunnis have to have the head of the parliament, the Shia have to have the prime ministership, and the Kurds have to have the presidency. We wanted to make this much more informal, far less of a constitutional issue. I'm not in a position to say how the Syrians would look at all this, except to say that if I'm an Alawite and I know how I've treated the Sunnis over the decades, I would probably not want to put down my gun until I'm pretty sure that I will be protected in some way. So I think that has to be dealt with, and I think some of these things can be dealt with, but picking up on the earlier points, I think we have to have a much better understanding with countries that are in the region, and unfortunately, like it or not, I think we have to have a little bit of a dialogue with the Iranians on this issue.
Very briefly, Professor Ayoob wants to say a word,
Just
and then I want
minutes
to
on
ask.
the identity
Yeah.
issue, the general
Yeah.
issue of identity and political identities and how
Yeah.
they become salient. Political identities, I've always argued, are very contextual. When the state is strong, political identity is normally defined in national terms.
Yeah.
When the state becomes weak or its capabilities begin to evaporate, then people take refuge in those identities that provide them security, sectarian, ethnic, and so on and so forth. I think that happened very clearly in Iraq, when the state, thanks to the American invasion, the state's capabilities were totally decimated. When Paul Bremer, in his infinite wisdom, got rid of the Iraqi armed forces and so on and so forth. And also, I mean, I don't want to get into the issue of American foreign policy, but there was a certain tendency to favor one group against the other, mistakenly assuming that the Ba'athist regime, that Saddam Hussein's regime, was a Sunni regime, which I think was far from true. But and the same thing is being played out now in Syria as well. I mean, not that Alawites did not dominate the rest of the country, not that these sectarian identities did not exist, but as the state capability has evaporated, people tend to take refuge in, I mean, the state, after all, is the what was the best word to describe a state? It's a protection racket par excellence. And when that protection racket no longer provides protection, then people look for other protection rackets.
Well, thank you. And I want to move away from the internal and external aspects of Syria and focus on simply the normative issue of responsibility to protect, R2P. And I think Syria has raised a pretty difficult question about R2P. Tom, you and I and Dick Falk, who talked about humanitarian intervention 30 years ago, sitting in Virginia, and have different kind of aspects of humanitarian intervention focused upon and emphasized. And there are people who have simply said that R2P is nothing else but humanitarian intervention in new bottles, old wine, and nothing new. But R2P is kind of an evolving concept. And I want to have your thoughts on is Danish initiative in talking about responsibility while protecting, focusing on the Security Council and Brazil. And Danish also have come in, but Brazilian initiative especially on protecting, protection while responsibility while protecting. And my own thought is that the United States, obviously, as you rightly said, is cautious, can't be imperialist anymore. But the United States does realize the constraints upon its own power and realizes that at the present time, it doesn't have that kind of a clout to be able to dictate terms. But on responsibility to protect, I want to go a step before your, I think, accurate analysis of the US being an indispensable party. But that step would come if responsibility to protect is invoked. But responsibility to protect is not even being invoked in the UN because it is not able to be operationalized. Do you see any possibility of R2P being operationalized, being invoked in the future? Or as you simply said, that Libya was a luxury and perhaps not to be repeated in the future?
It's true that we've been debating humanitarian intervention as a norm for at least 30 years. Responsibility to protect is part of the process of what you might call norm entrepreneurship. That's how norms get established or fail to be established. Some group of countries, whether it has to do with humanitarian intervention or the extent of the territorial sea or the degree that countries will have control of the resources of the sea out to a certain length. A group of countries see it in their interest to develop a particular norm in a given area of international social life and try it out. And they try it out in different forums. They try it out in bilateral forums, regional forums, the United Nations Forum. And often there's a competitive norm operating, which may be the status quo, or it may be a third option. And sometimes a sufficient coincidence of interest can occur over time after much struggle so that a new norm becomes widely accepted. So the territorial sea used to be, for a couple of centuries, was generally accepted as being 3 miles, and eventually, as part of this process of, you could call norm entrepreneurship or competition to establish norms, a consensus evolved that it would be a 12-mile territorial sea. And eventually all of this was codified, although it took 10 years of negotiation to get there. In the case of humanitarian intervention, the first point I made in my talk was that consensus hasn't formed, and I don't see any prospect that it will form. Is there somewhat greater readiness to accept the possibility? Is there a greater readiness to allow international appreciation of the way a country treats its own citizens? Yes. That the whole human rights movement of the past 50 years is evidence of the erosion of absolutist ideas about sovereignty. And the absolutist idea, in its most perfect form, is that the way a country treats its citizens, not the citizens of other states who happen to be temporarily inhabiting or passing through our country, but their own citizens, the absolutist form said that's strictly an internal matter. And indeed, that was the basis of modern international law in the Westphalian settlement back in the 1600s. Obviously, there's been erosion. If there hadn't been erosion, there wouldn't be a human rights movement. There wouldn't be human rights norms. But when it comes to the actual use of force, there is still enormous reluctance by consequential states to legitimizing it. I think that's so clear that there's really nothing to discuss. For the Chinese, now the Chinese don't have any particular interest in Syria, but they're not prepared to legitimate armed intervention, ostensibly on behalf of the human rights of the inhabitants. A, because it would raise questions about the treatment of their citizens by China, but B, because the Chinese elite and many other elites, particularly from the global south, believe that neither the United States nor any other Western power is primarily motivated by humanitarian concerns, but they believe that we're motivated primarily by the same interests that motivate them. Control over resources, control over population, influence over surrounding geography, and so on. And so it's a combination of cynicism. Let's say most elites take a realist view of the world because they project onto other countries their own view of the world. And as long as elites have these views, they're going to be generally hostile. And then occasionally a ripe plum will appear. Libya was such a case for all the reasons I suggested. and the Chinese were willing in that instance to acquiesce. Remember, they didn't vote in favor of the authorization, and they acquiesced on a narrower position, which was that we could go and give humanitarian assistance. It was difficult to do one without actually affecting regime change. If I could just conclude with a loosely connected point, which is associated with the points that Professor Ayoob and Ambassador Hill said. The probability is that unless you are prepared to be deeply involved in the determination of who governs in the context of a civil conflict, the probability is that you'll have very limited influence on the ultimate political outcome. And so it is natural to be cautious, very natural to be cautious. But everything that's happened in Syria, the massacre, the increasing sectarian identity, all of this is entirely predictable. There are no surprises, it seems to me, nor am I personally surprised by the durability of the regime. The regime has been preparing for this, preparing for an uprising for what, 40 years? It's not Libya. They didn't hollow out their security forces. They have powerful security forces, and they have a core within the security forces that are deeply embedded in terms of interest in the existing regime. So nothing that has happened is surprising. And sometimes there are only two responses. One is early use of kinetic decisive force. And the other is, well, hope for the best, tinker at the edges. Now, if we were not the enemies of Iran, then there is a possibility in some cases of playing a catalytic or organizing or coordinating role. But because of our position in the Middle East, I don't believe that we're very hampered, if not hamstrung, in playing that role. And I still feel if we don't play that role, it's very hard to see who will play that role.
Well, thank you very much, Tom. I think it's time that you take the floor, but before I do that, I need to say to Nader that you invited an international lawyer, and in this bastion of political realism, I still need to say one thing, that when genocide happens, war crimes happen, crimes against humanity happen, the way it has been happening from the killing fields of Cambodia to Rwanda to all that is happening in the Congo, I think for the international community not to be able to do something is intolerable. And how to do it is an issue. And this responsibility to protect is not simply the military use of force. I think the thought here simply was, as was said, 3 pillars. You put a great deal of focus on preventive aspect. You put a great deal of focus on building capacity, helping other countries, assisting them, seeing that they have the capacity to deal with these kind of problems. It might seem abstract, but to an international lawyer, these norms to be created, norms to be followed, they obviously are going to take some time, but I think that's a very important part, and that is why I focused on the responsibility to protect as a norm, not simply for the use of military force. That comes at the very end. That comes as when there is no other possibility and alternative as a last resort. But I won't pursue it anymore, and let us go to our friends. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Radwansi. I am the director of the Syrian Center.
Could you kindly address them and just look on? Yeah, please come. And I am just going to ask, I was not brief, but you don't have to do what I do, but you have to do what I say. Be brief.
I'm Radwan Ziyad, director of the Damascus Center for Human Rights Studies, which an organization work on documentation of human rights violations in Syria, and the first organization called for responsibility to protect in Syria. But my question to Ambassador Chris and Professor Ayoob, as a Syrian, we missed the Syrian in your talk. Because exactly what's the definition of when we say that sectarian Sunni? This is a term which is new for me, especially for someone who coming from Syria. And secondly, this comparison between Syria and other nations always actually put us in the problems that we do have a model, and then we do have to repeat the same model in other countries. Syria is quite different from Afghanistan. Afghanistan never have a central government. Syria, which always it was the first democratic country in the Middle East in the 40s, have the first constitution in the Middle East, which gave the woman the right to vote before many European countries. This is why the issue in Syria quite different in Iraq. In Syria, we have at least, if we look to the statistics, 74 are Sunni. And the Shia, we have only 1 or 2%, and the Alawite is 10 to 12%. And when the uprising started, it's across the sects, across the ethnics, all they calling for freedom and dignity. And this is why there is Alawite being killed, there is Christian, and there is, of course, the vast majority of the victims are Sunni because the majority. This is why implementing what's called the sectarian federalism or ethnic, it's of course is not comparable in Syria, because the vast majority of Alawites in Damascus, in the capital. How you can divide the capital? And the vast majority of the Kurds are in the capital and in Aleppo. And this is why we have to think again. The Syrian opposition, they have a proposal. They say exactly the transition that's the constitution of Syria 1950, that will be the constitution on the future, then until we have to form a new constitution. The second and last comment, that we cannot think about the transition if we don't know exactly how the Assad will get out from power. And this is actually a thing we always have a discussion with this administration. We have to think about the Assad, the days of Bashar Assad counting. Secretary Clinton repeated that 7 times, and she's still counting. And this is why we don't know, if we don't know exactly how the Assad will go from power, we don't know exactly how the transition will be. If there is a peaceful transition with no one is believing in that, and otherwise, this is why it's something very linked, and we have to think about that. Thank you very much.
Is this working?
Yeah, if you speak in it
Okay.
closer, then it will work.
Thank you, Rahman, for those comments. As you might have noticed, I did not use the term sectarian Sunni at all in my presentation, because I know that 3/4 of the population is Sunni. And as you said very correctly, initially when the democratic movement, the peaceful democratic movement started, it cut across the sectarian and ethnic divides. You're very right. It was the regime that started the process of giving the conflict between the regime and the opposition a sectarian color or nature, in an effort to get the Alawites, who did form a predominant or a large proportion of the ruling elite, this feeling that they were that everything they had achieved was at risk, and they had achieved a lot. If you go back to the history of Syria from the Ottoman times and into the colonial period, it was only under the French that the French instituted deliberately this policy of favoring the Alawites, particularly in the military services, after the Damascus uprisings and so on. But that they had a lot to lose, so that they must circle their wagons. But there was also, one must not forget, that particularly the Saudis collaborated in this in this regime with this regime strategy by funding the most extreme elements, by adopting a policy which pitted the Sunnis against the Alawites. For them, deliberately, they fudged the difference between the Alawite and the Shia. I think this is one of the things that I keep telling my friends in the West. The Alawites are not Shia. They might be strategic allies of Iran, but they are not Shia. But for the Saudis, it was convenient to project them as Shia, because they have an anti-Iranian agenda. which goes back to probably to the Shah, but certainly to the Islamic Revolution. I remember I used to be with the Australian National University when the revolution took place in Iraq. And I wrote an article in the Sydney Morning Herald which ended on the note that this revolution has literally put the fear of Allah into the Saudis. And the Saudis have never got over that fear. So there was a deliberate attempt to fudge those issues. So there was, it's interesting how the two extremes came together to project this. But I do agree that it wasn't necessarily a Sunni Alawite issue, and that Syria did have a central state, but these ethnic and sectarian identities did exist at the same time. And as I argued earlier, once the state's foundations began to shake, then they resurfaced and became much more relevant to the present condition.
I agree with that. I think the issue that, from the point of view of U.S. policy, has been that the Syrian opposition has not been able to coalesce. It has been deeply divided. There have been difficulties in attracting Alawite participation to it. And as a consequence, I think the divisions within the country are very deep, and therefore the solutions are elusive. So I think what the United States has been trying to do is try to bring more people together within the under the banner of the opposition, and to try to encourage different identities to share in that. I agree with the proposition that we did not start off with a kind of Sunni sectarian role, but when you look at some of the groups, especially some of the groups that have been more successful on the battlefield than others, they would fall under a definition of sectarian. I don't like it, you don't like it, no one likes it, but I think that's kind of the fact of the matter. So I think there does need to be a clearer vision of what the country looks like. If it can go back to these to earlier times, to a greater scope for civil society, that would be great. But I submit to you that all over the region, there has been less civil society and more sectarianism in recent years for a variety of purposes, not necessarily just politics. I think the role of religion, and it's not just in the Arab world, it's even in our world here in the U.S., has been greater today than it is in the past. Even if there are fewer believers in the U.S. today, you will hear the word God a lot more in our political discourse than you ever did before. Interesting phenomena, and I suspect Syria is not immune to that. But you ask a very important question, which is, it's hard to think about all of this until we can see the pathway for Assad to leave. I think there does need to be a greater some greater work on what the consensus is for getting him to leave. But I don't think you can expect the U.S. military to do that for Syria. And I think while we have talked about the Syrian people, we haven't talked enough about the American people here. And when you commit military force, this is a serious means to a serious ends. And I think you will be hard-pressed, as Professor Fair noted, I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a kind of support in this country for sending our forces again. And I suspect that you'll be hard-pressed to see even a Libya type approach, because dropping ordnance in the middle of a civil war is not something that any country wants to do, least of all the United States. So I think what we really need to see from the Syrian opposition is a little structure. We need to see a leadership that is worthy of the name, that can articulate what this vision is. I don't see a lot of leadership in the Syrian opposition at this point. I think if you ask most Americans to name 3 members of the Syrian opposition, I think you'd be hard-pressed to get anyone to be able to do that. So I think, like a lot of things, I think it is primarily the responsibility of the Syrians to step up, create some structure in this opposition, and show that that it is capable of taking on the job beyond al-Assad.
Very good. I'm going to take 2 questions, and then they'll be able to respond. So kindly again, if you can, be brief.
Thank you. I'm Thomas Pierre from the University of Edinburgh. I'd like to discuss Professor Ayoob's vision of a post-Assad regional arrangement. So you mentioned three key countries, Turkey, Russia, and Iran. And I mean, there is no doubt that Turkey will be important, but I'm not sure Russia and Iran have a future in Syria. I mean, first, they will be treated as enemy states by any post-Assad regime. Second, they basically don't have any soft power in Syria. I mean, all of their influence in Syria relies on their relation with the Assad regime. Once it's gone, they don't have anything. They don't have ties with the opposition. They have very limited ties with Syrian society. I mean, Iranians are funding religious institutions, but they cater for foreigners, not for Syrians. On the other hand, I'm not sure it is realistic or wise to exclude Saudi Arabia for such a post-Assad regional arrangement. For two reasons. First, Saudi Arabia, contrary to Iran and Russia, has very, very deep relations with Syrian society through migrant workers, tribal connections, investments. And it's a country where once Assad is gone, Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries in general will have an interest in the stability of Syria, much more than Iran, for instance, because it's at backyard. Instability in Syria would threaten the stability of Jordan, and stability of Jordan is very important for Saudi Arabia. So Gulf countries will be among the very few countries in the world who will have both the means and the will to invest in Syrian economy in order to rebuild it. So I'm not sure it is realistic or wise to exclude them from that. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, hi. I'll ask a question. My name is Oliver, Capital lecturer here. My question is for all the panelists, but based on a comment that Crystal made about how international powers can help guarantee post-conflict settlement in Syria. And the question is, what can international actors or Western actors do to make such an agreement credible, especially for the protection of minorities? So can they do anything to enhance the credibility of such an agreement so that minorities actually believe that the agreement will go into effect once a post-conflict state is reached?
Okay, thanks. Those were very interesting comments, Professor Pierre. I agree with you that Turkey has more soft power than Iran or probably anyone else in Syrian society. The reason why I included Russia and particularly Iran in this tripod, if you want to call it, is because of their investment in the current regime. If you're talking about a post-Assad, a negotiated settlement post-Assad, a negotiated arrangement post-Assad, that means you have to still include remnants of this regime. You have to come to terms with structures of power that already exist, and that's where Iran and Russia both have, both have a stake and influence. And therefore, you cannot ignore that part of that. And that's why I think it's important to have Iran and Russia and Turkey come together to form a regional consensus. I'm sure the Saudis would have to be included in that too. That could form, the basis of also then an intra-Syrian arrangement, because once you have, as the arrangement on Bosnia, for example, was referred to, there was an agreement about what the contours of Bosnia are going to look like. You need something like of that sort, on which all the major external players are agreed upon. And I agree, Saudi Arabia does play an important role there. But I wanted to very briefly, if I may, come back to something earlier I had. I'll come back to it later. Oh yeah, the Ridwan's point about. I agree that Syria did have a relatively strong centralized state, but much of that centralized state strength was established during the Ba'ath regime, particularly under Hafez al-Assad. And Syria always has, there's been a lot of contention between the Syrian national. Well, I think the affinity of the Syrian people to Syrian nationalism was probably weaker than their affinity to the Syrian state, because there's always been tussle between Syrian nationalism and Arab nationalism. Syria was, after all, Greater Syria was the heartland of Arab nationalism. It was in Greater Syria when Aflaq and Akram Hourani founded the Ba'ath Party. So there's always been that tussle as to how do you define Syria? Of course, Arab nationalism excludes the Kurds and the other non-Arab minorities, whereas Syrian nationalism may not appeal, an exclusive form of Syrian nationalism may not appeal to all those who are committed to Arab nationalism. I remember many years ago, going back 3 decades or more, an Egyptian sociologist telling me this, which probably was, it was a sort of a wise remark, that I asked him, what's the difference between Syrians and Egyptians? This was in the aftermath of the October War, 1973. And he said, well, one major difference is that Syrians are Arabs who happen to be Syrians. Egyptians are Egyptians who happen to be Arabs. Yeah. And I think that explains the Syrian dilemma.
Thank you. Professor Falk? I was going to specially call you to say a few words, if you could, on the humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect, but you don't have to, whatever you would like to talk about.
Let me thank all 3 panelists for providing us with very illuminating and persuasive presentations. I wanted to ask Ambassador Hill if he could clarify a bit what is meant by saying Assad has to go. Is one talking about the regime, or is one talking about a person, or what is one talking about when one uses that kind of formulation, which is quite common in this discourse? Because it seems to me to be quite a different proposition if one's talking about a person and a structure of state power. And what is the real precondition for moving to a second stage? Tom Farah's presentation was very much in line with my own thinking. I do feel that you didn't come quite to terms with the limits on military force in a post-colonial setting. That in almost every instance since the end of World War II, military superiority has not been very effective in controlling political outcomes. And I think one of the consistent failures of American foreign policy is to think that a military solution is the way in which to drive history forward, and a lack of respect for the politics of self-determination. And I felt a little bit that Ambassador Hill also, in talking about the external powers devising the political arrangements for a post-Assad Syria, overlooked the degree to which self-determination is the defining political ethos of this period. And it relates also, it seems to me, to the exaggeration of the role of secular forces in reshaping self-determination. All over the Middle East, there's been a consistent underestimation of the political attractiveness to the populations of religiously oriented political perspectives. I remember being in Egypt shortly after Tahrir Square in 2011, and almost all the people, Egyptians I spoke to, thought that it was that Amma Musa would be the next president, and that there was very little dissent from that. It turned out he had extremely little support in the country, and there was an underestimation of both the Muslim Brotherhood's strength and the Salafi emergence as a political force. The same thing was true in Gaza in underestimating the appeal of Hamas, and I think the same thing was true in Iraq during the occupation. So I think it's very important to understand both the dynamics of self-determination as it operates in a state-centric world order where the logistics of intervention, whether it's desirable or undesirable, have proved to have developed a record where it very seldom succeeds.
Well, thank you very much. Let me just pick up on this issue of political arrangements. You bet political arrangements cannot just be arranged in, Moscow or Washington or Beijing, for that matter. I think what needs to be done is that through kind of intensive diplomacy, you get a couple of countries around a proposal, you shop it to others, you continue to work it, and I think ultimately the Syrian opposition for Syrian civil society, which will include some sectarian elements, I completely agree with that proposition, would need to get behind this. Again, I don't think one can do all the constitutional arrangements. And by the way, I think a lot of this can probably be stuff dusted off from the past. I think one of the big problems in Iraq was this notion, we went in there with a kind of, the United States went in there with, like it was some sort of, summer Bible school, and, what are the accoutrements of a democracy? Well, you need a central bank, so we gave them the Federal Reserve System, when in fact the Iraqis had, lo and behold, had some experience with a central bank before. So I think, you could probably dust off some elements, but I think you have to have it as a kind of guide rather than a finished product to try to attract as many groups as possible to it, because I think in the end you do need to convince all parties, especially people with carrying guns, that that there's a future for them and that they should put down their gun. And so I don't think that's an impossibility. But I think to the extent to which the Russians and the U.S. cannot agree on anything on this is not helpful. And I think those divisions can also get reflected on the ground as well in Syria. So I think it is important for great powers to work together, but ultimately we are talking, as you correctly said, we're talking about self-determination, and so you have to get people on the ground to support this. But here, as I said earlier, I think the Syrian opposition really needs to step it up a little in terms of taking some greater responsibility. The fact that they cannot seem to agree on a single person to even explain their position is I think problematic in and of itself. So I think waiting around expecting the great powers to do things for them is not the way to go. I think there does need to be, this Syrian issue has gone on long enough that I don't think this is a kind of situation where the international community can forget about it once these political arrangements are agreed. And I would think, to answer Professor Kaplan's question, I think you ultimately need to get some type of instrument supported by the UN and perhaps through a Chapter 6 mandate of UN peacekeepers who would be there to see that things work their way or are actually implemented on the ground. Now in Bosnia, we had the UN there when we should have had NATO, and then we had NATO there when we should have had the UN. Because you cannot expect the UN to go into a circumstance where there is not consensus. So I think, and yet in Syria, I think we're going to need a kind of consensus-driven international presence, some kind of Chapter 6. And if the political arrangements go well, and if the Syrian opposition can be perceived as being people who may not agree with each other on what political party structure should be, but at least agree on each other on what the overall structure in which those political parties would operate, I think that would be very, very helpful. And this issue about sectarian role in the political opposition, I know there's a certain political incorrectness to talk about sectarian issues. And I think from the point of view of Syrians who see themselves as a civil society, it's a little demeaning and condescending at times to talk about sectarianism. But I don't think people in Syria should see this as some sort of homegrown Syrian issue. It is happening everywhere. And I simply think that we ought to kind of understand that it's there. It may not be dominant. It may not even play a role in post-Assad politics. But for now, it's a factor, and I don't think we can kind of wish it away. I think it does need to be looked at, and it does. And to me, it's an index of the more we kind of stay away from it, and the more we say this is their problem, not our problem, the more we're going to strengthen this type of sectarianism. Because I completely agree with Professor Ayyoob's point that in the absence of state structures, often these sectarian structures are strengthened.
Tom?
Dick Falk and I have pretty much identical values. We've always, I think, disagreed a bit about the decisiveness of force. Force has often been successful in achieving political outcomes. Unfortunately, usually political outcomes you and I despise. Force was decisive in achieving the political outcome in Central America, for example. In Salvador, it was decisive. It was decisive in Guatemala. We could actually, force worked for a time in Afghanistan. The regime that the Russians, that the Soviets left behind, would probably have survived if the Soviet Union had survived and continued to provide support, financial and military support for that regime. It was a surprise, but it did. I could cite 100 other cases. This relates, of course, to the question that you raised, Ali, about what kind of guarantees do you provide for minorities? Actually, you need the majority also need a guarantee, because it's not clear that the majority will have the decisive military force. The ultimate question is not the constitutional shape of the society. The ultimate question is who controls the army and the police. And if you don't have any, if you're able to create some kind of structure, of political structure, which has some incipient legitimacy, this helps to deal with the problem of the army and the police, because if they're at all professional in their training, then they want to serve an authority. So if you can create something that, as I say, has at least an incipient aura of legitimacy, then even though the police and army you inherit has a certain sectarian composition, it still may be possible for them to function and to serve the new Constitution. If I can drop a footnote there, I don't have any of the unease that Chris Hill has about what academics call consociational arrangements, which is like Lebanon, where you guarantee to each of the groups in society, whether they're defined by religion or color or tribe or tribal association, we'll call them sectarian groups, where each one is guaranteed in the Constitution a particular position. You could say Switzerland is organized that way, and quite successfully. Lebanon is a mixed bag, but that's partially because of the very difficult environment in which the country functions. But what would Lebanon be like without that set of arrangements? It might not even exist as a state. So democracy, that is, representative government, can assume a variety of forms. And one of the forms it can assume is making sure that all of the elements in society that have a sense of identity, both an internal sense and are seen as others as having a distinctive sense, have an assured place in the society. I'm not the least bit uncomfortable about that. I don't think that's inconsistent with American values, and it may be the only way to organize many of the societies we're talking about, which don't have a strong sense of central national feeling. Without the advantage of using force early in Syria, that is, of of literally decapitating the regime. How is Assad leaving? You could say, well, he'd leave on a stretcher, he'd leave in a coffin. But at the same time, assuring the security services that we're not going to have in Iraq, that we are not going to destroy the state structure. That's not our policy. On the contrary. Then, to me, that was the only way to have a transition in which existing elements of state power could combine with other parts of the society. Without that, I believe that everything that has happened, as I said before, is entirely predictable. You can wring your hands, you can talk about the limits of force, but I don't see any other scenario than the one that we have observed. When people don't have a guarantee of their security, they are not going to put down the gun. They're going to pick up the gun or accept the status quo.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, I just want to say, because I didn't address Professor Fox's question about what do I mean by Assad must go, I would keep it as narrow a concept as possible. And I think I agree with Tom that in Iraq, a narrow concept of Saddam Hussein must go turned into a very broad concept of the Ba'athist Party, and anyone associated with the regime must go. And the problem with that is, our concept of that was akin to denazification. But within Iraq, the concept was understood to mean de-Sunnification. Whether that was accurate or not, that was certainly how the Sunni community, that was one thing I would say the Shia and the Sunni community agreed with. That is, when you go after the Ba'athist elements in Iraq, the Sunnis believed it was against them, and the Shia believed it was against the Sunnis. So when that came up again in the 2010 the run-up to the 2010 elections, it was again perceived as a move against the Sunnis. So I think it was very damaging, and as such, I think it's very important to avoid that in the future. As a consequence, I would just try to limit this to Assad. And by the way, there's some people who would say we should not even try to eliminate Assad, let him lose in an election. The only trouble is you do have the issue that sooner or later he will be, I think, seriously indicted for war crimes. I think then you'd have the issue of having to somehow exclude him through some sort of international war crimes process, which probably wouldn't go too well within Syria. So I think kind of sticking to the Assad must go and referring to it in a narrow context is the way to go.
Yeah, very, very briefly.
Final words.
Okay. Just there were two issues raised in my mind, which came to my mind after when Professor Falk was speaking. One, this issue of the Falk-Farah consensus on humanitarian intervention, and the other, the role of religion. The Falk-Farah, for the lack of a better word, consensus. I've been a very strong skeptic of that. If any of you read some of my stuff. I was a consultant. Yeah, I wrote a brief for the commission that produced the R2P report.
I saw your comments.
You did? Okay. And there I had, it was a 10,000-word brief, and I'm going to summarize it in 3 words, or 3 phrases as to why I was a skeptic. One, there's a certain group of countries that had appropriated to themselves the power to define what is the international community. So the international community, the word that was used, did not necessarily reflect international opinions in a wider sense. Secondly, that the R2P, the responsibility to protect, and all the humanitarian interventions that had preceded it were very selective in nature, and that decisions to undertake these interventions were national decisions. The decisions were taken by national decision-making apparata or apparatuses, I don't know what the right word is. And so if you have that, then you really can't have humanitarian intervention. And I wrote 10,000 words. And they were finally published in the International Journal of Human Rights, arguing that case. On the religious, on the role of religion, I think it's partially true that the role of religion resurfaced as a result of democratization, but there's also a history to that in terms of the Islamist movements. I mean, the authoritarian regimes in the Middle East had done such a great job of decimating the secular opposition that it left the political field wide open for the religious movements to take on the role of either the sole or the primary opponents of the regime, and that's how they built credibility. And to bring it and to conclude on the Amr Musa note, I mean, everybody knew that Amr Musa was a watered down version of Ahmed Shafiq. So if you're going to vote for the regime's candidate, the old regime's candidate, why not vote for Ahmed Shafiq? I mean, Amr Musa had been Mubarak's foreign minister. Mubarak had pushed him out, but pushed him into the cushy job of Secretary General of the Arab League. And his good friend in these days, his buddy Mohammed Ayoob, was in a cushy job sitting in Vienna or Geneva or wherever he was. While Morsi, the Muslim Brotherhood, and its cadres were manning the barricades against the Mubarak regime. So obviously there was an issue of credibility here. And whether one likes the Brotherhood or not, one should give it the credit for having, for several decades, opposed the regime, sacrificed, I'm not a Brotherhood person, but sacrificed lives and careers and money and whatever in opposition to the regime. So the credibility of the Brotherhood was very high, regardless of its religious nature.
Well, thank you very much. I know that there are many of you who have comments and who have questions. And fortunately, we don't have a panel immediately after this. And so kindly do come up and talk. I wish that I had the opportunity for you to be able to make some comment that hasn't been done here. But I think we are already about 10, 15 minutes behind in time. And so kindly join me in thanking my colleagues, and you got to agree with me. It's a difficult topic, but these have been enlightening comments for all of us, and we are all enriched by what they have contributed, and I want to thank them.